Good afternoon, and welcome to RCLCO's monthly webinar. This month, we will discuss the Next American Cities report produced earlier this year by the Urban Reform Institute. As an introduction, I'm Greg Logan, a managing director here at RCLCO, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. I'm joined by the Next American Cities authors, Wendell Cox and Joel Kotkin, who will present their report, and then we'll have reactions from our expert panel, as well as time for audience questions. We'll get into our discussion in a minute, but as a reminder, these webinars are designed to be interactive and engaging. So if you have any questions throughout the process, please submit the questions to the chat box, and we'll do our best to address them in the course of the webinar, and we've allowed time at the end, especially for audience Q&A. Please note also that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the RCLCO website shortly after we end today. A link to the full New American Cities report will be included with detailed biographies for the Urban Reform Institute leadership and our two author presenters. Also, when you go to download this information, please be sure to check out all the other research and presentations that we have been publishing at rclco.com. You'll find lots of interesting and insightful content on important real estate trends. As you know, each year RCLCO publishes 2 annual reports on the top master plan communities in the country, and we've always believed that they're an integral part of the evolving urban form of the country. So we were pretty excited when we saw the Urban Reform Institute's report on the Next American Cities, where they're suggesting that these master plan communities are an emerging new format for cities that in many cases are better at creating environments for successful living than many of our nation's urban core areas. That's not to say that our urban centers don't have a lot to offer, but as the authors will show, people are voting with their feet in terms of the growth of these suburban places as compared to the urban cores, and they represent a growing share of the nation's economic activity as well. Before I introduce our presenters, I'd like to introduce our co-sponsor today, Charles Blaine. Charles is CEO of the Urban Reform Institute and publisher of the New American Cities report. Charles, welcome.
Thanks, Greg. Good morning, and good morning to the audience. My name is Charles Blaine. I'm president of Urban Reform Institute, and I want to thank RCLCO for working with us to put on this webinar today. Also want to thank the audience for tuning in, and of course, thank our panelists for taking the time out to participate in today's conversation. I also want to make a special thank you to one of our panelists, Joel Farkas, as without his support, Urban Reform Institute wouldn't have initiated this research and released this report that we're discussing today. We started this in the middle of the pandemic, but the trends that our panelists will be discussing began before that. We started with one question, and it was, with the changing dynamics of local government and regulation, the social challenges big cities are facing, and affordability being a primary factor of where people choose to live, work, and play, where would the Next American Cities be? And what we quickly realized was that the Next American Cities weren't really cities at all. They were, like you said, Greg, these master plan communities. We realized that the places that we'll be discussing today offer solutions and alternatives to the major cities that we've come to know, but without the same structure that we've come to expect. And we realized that they serve as a model of a product for families who are seeking better opportunities. Urban Reform Institute's board is another group that I'd like to thank as being instrumental in the work that we do and specifically this project. Earlier this year, we did lose one board member who has been a pioneer for this type of community, our board member, Larry Johnson of Johnson Development Corporation. Because of his leadership and because of the leadership and continued support of our board, we've been able to do this work. And so with that, I'll leave it there and turn it back to Greg, because I know everyone's excited to hear our practitioners and our panelists discuss what this report uncovered. So thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Allow me to introduce our presenters. Wendell Cox is a principal of Demographia, which is a St. Louis-based public policy consulting firm. And he also importantly serves as a senior fellow at the Urban Reform Institute. Joel Kotkin is executive director of the Urban Reform Institute, and he is the R.C. Hobbs Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University. I'll now turn this over to Wendell and Joel to share their study with us.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg, and thanks, Charles, and the whole team for making this possible. I just want to make a couple of quick remarks, and then Wendell will guide us through the statistics, because one of the things that's very important is that we're really dealing with the numbers. As Charles said, people are voting for their feet. And with their feet. And I think one of the things that I think we need to understand is America has always excelled at building new places. After all, we built the first, we built cities, we built suburbs, we built communities out in the middle of the Great Plains. We were good at this stuff. And in the last, I would say 10 to 20 years in much of the country, you cannot build the kind of communities people want. We have a planning community that says everyone has to live in a dense environment. Now, many people want that dense environment, particularly when they're young, but eventually they want to find something else. So what I found really exciting is not only were these communities successful, and I live in Orange County, so Irvine is the perfect example of what these communities can do. But when Charles and I went out to West Houston and we visited some of the communities, the Woodlands and others, what you're seeing is these are communities that people actually really want to live in. They want to raise families in. They feel safe in. And in the era of remote work, many of them can spend much of their time there. So we're trying to imagine a new future. It's not a future in which cities don't exist or they're not important. They will play a very important role. But these new communities are an outlet for America's middle and working class families who want to build a better life. And I think it's up to us, whether in the real estate industry or in the think tank world, to provide opportunities so Americans can live better in the future, not worse. So let's take a look at some of the numbers Wendell has. And I think you'll find it pretty convincing.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Greg, for this event. It's an exciting thing. The first slide we're going to look at, and I want to give you a little background on what we did. We basically said, let's look at the 50 fastest growing communities, that is counties, in terms of net domestic migration. Excuse me. And we wanted to look at the last 5 years. That would have been 2015 to 2020. And the reason for that is because, and this was picked up by Bill Fry at Brookings as well, and a number of other analysts, there has been a massive shift in terms of net domestic migration from larger metropolitan areas to smaller metropolitan areas, and in the last year, even outside the metropolitan and micropolitan areas. And so we basically looked at those last 5 years and said, let's look at the 50 counties that had the highest percentage of net domestic migration in the country. And what we found essentially was they were all, first of all, or most of them were in large combined statistical areas. This is sort of the overlapping metropolitan area classification that the Census Bureau uses, that, for example, finds San Jose and San Francisco to be in the same metropolitan area, which I know will shock many of you. But in any event, let's look at what has been going on in net domestic migration. You look at in the early 2010s, where there was some thought that we had a return to the city. We never really did in terms of net domestic migration, but the core cities, or I should say the core counties, because net domestic migration is only measured at the county level, not below that with respect to Census Bureau data. You see the core counties did pretty well. That they dropped a couple of thousand short of actually gaining, and the counties around them in the metropolitan areas and micropolitan areas gained about 100,000. I can't actually see it on the screen, but on the far end, you're going to see that in the last year, there has been an absolute tanking of net domestic migration to core counties. When we started working on this, we were looking at a situation where things look pretty bad for the core counties, but not terrible. But what's happened in the last year, and we've updated this slide to pick up the last year that's just been released within the last month or so. Within the last year, the net domestic migration out of the nation's core counties among the 56 metropolitan areas of more than 1 million, 4 of which we can't count because they only have one county. But the net domestic out migration in those core counties was 1.1 million. The suburban counties were up 350,000. But the other amazing thing that's gone on is that the smaller metropolitan areas are now gaining net domestic migrants faster. And believe it or not, outside The fastest gain over the last year in terms of net domestic migration was outside the metropolitan areas and the micropolitan areas. Now, that doesn't mean it's rural, but it does mean it's either small town or non-metropolitan. So that is an important change and a surprising change that's happened with respect to demographics in the country. Can we get the next slide, please? For 8 years, we developed 8 years ago something we call the city sector model, which is an attempt to break down major metropolitan population based upon lifestyles, function, and so on. And essentially, we have 5 classifications: the urban core CBDs, the inner ring of the urban core, the inner suburbs, the outer suburbs, and the exurbs. And we know that the fact is growth throughout this decade has been largely in the suburban and exurban areas. I believe we will have our piece out on the latest data, which is the 5-year data for 2016, I should say for 2020. It'll be out soon, but it's shown on this chart, and it essentially indicates that since 2010, according to the American Community Survey small area data, about 93% of the growth in major metropolitan areas has been outside the inner ring. Now, the inner ring and the urban core, these classifications have nothing whatever to do with municipal boundaries. And that was the big problem with the data before. You only could use municipal boundaries, and municipal boundaries might make a lot of sense if you're in Boston or New York. They make no sense when you're in Phoenix, for example, or San Jose, with respect to lifestyles, because these places are essentially all suburban. So, and the other interesting thing that's gone on in our new data is the newest data is showing that over the last year of data for which the Census Bureau, or I should say ACS, has data, the suburban counties and exurban counties, zip codes, I should say, had 101% of the growth. In other words, the urban core lost population. Then the next slide, if we could, please. Now, what we want to do is now slip back to those 50 counties that we were talking about. And these are counties, there's a real concentration of these counties, both in retirement areas and in growing areas that are not necessarily retirement areas. The fastest growing such county is in St. John County, just south of Jacksonville, Florida. Yet number 2 and 3 are in the Austin area, Williamson County to the south, and Hayes County to the north of Travis County, which is where the largest city, Austin, is located. And beyond that, you have a bunch of counties in the Nashville area, in the Atlanta area. And again, mainly we're looking at southern counties, but the other interesting thing is that among the counties that are not in major metropolitan areas, the smaller metropolitan areas, virtually all of them are little more than a 2-hour drive. That's sort of the maximum to a major metropolitan area, to an outer county of a major metropolitan area. And that's because, I sort of say that's what researchers have sort of identified as one of the issues with respect to remote work. That is like a 2-hour commute, which makes it possible to go into the office once a day, once a week, or once a month, or whatever it wants to be. Yeah, you want it to be. And beyond that, you should recognize this does not mean that they're 2 hours from Manhattan. It means they're 2 hours from 23 of the 24 counties in the New York metropolitan area that are considered central counties. In other words, the way the Census Bureau and the OMB now deal with this, they recognize the great dispersion of jobs that has occurred. But what we have here is the highest growth county. These 50 counties that we're dealing with are growing close to 3 times as fast as the other counties in the country in terms of employment, and about 3 times as fast as the nation overall. So employment is going there. And it's important also because when we look at places like New York or San Francisco or Boston or Chicago, the downtown areas, the central business districts are really, really impressive. I love taking pictures of them from airplanes. But the fact is, what a lot of people find it hard to believe is only about 10% of the employment in this country is in central business districts, and it never gets much more than 20% in the New York area. San Francisco, it's not much, it's even less. So There is a huge dispersion of employment, and that employment is not only in the edge cities that Joel Garreau came up with 30 years ago, but also more and much more in dispersed areas beyond the suburban centers. And then next slide, please. We wanted to show also how these counties compare to the rest of the country in some other indicators as well. One is how many kids are these people having? When you think about the fact that we're looking at the lowest fertility rates in this country that we've ever seen, and they seem to be dropping like a rock at this point, these high growth counties are actually doing much better in terms of fertility rates and children. You can see that, and you have to be careful with these high growth counties, because if you get a county that happens to have the villages in it, you know, the fastest growing metropolitan area in the country, and one that's almost all senior, you don't have many kids. So we pulled out the high growth counties that had a disproportionately high senior population, and looked at the other high growth counties, and you can see the high growth counties where the seniors are excluded, the big senior shares have many more kids than the others. Next slide, please. Okay, now the interesting thing about the suburbs is they're not your father's or grandfather's suburbs anymore. These are not the white suburbs of 1960. Things have changed rapidly. You can see here what's happened from 2010 to 2019 in ethnic and racial, as well as foreign-born data around in these 50 counties. And the interesting thing is, if you look at those orange bars, which happen to be the share of people, the share of the growth in these 15 counties that is in either that ethnicity or that race, it is almost exactly the same as the national rate. White non-Hispanics at about 60%, African-American at about 13, Asian at about 6 or 7, Hispanic at 18.7, and foreign-born, I think, came in exactly 13.7. Now, one of the problems you have to realize with this data is that the new data in 2020 is very difficult to reconcile with the previous data. The Census Bureau indicates that they think it's because people understood the questions better, or maybe they took some efforts to make sure that people answered them like they were expected to answer them. So there are huge differences that I'm hoping some statistical experts will come up with ways to reconcile. But this is what it looked like in 2019. 2020 is a different issue. Next slide, please. You see also a comparison of the urban core. This is using our city sector model versus the suburbs and exurbs, and you see how much stronger home ownership is. And in virtually every racial and ethnic category, home ownership is much higher, and that continues to be, I think, the aspiration. We see all sorts of stuff on almost a daily basis from people that are running surveys talking about how disconcerted younger people are because they fear that they can't ever buy a home. Yet recently, I saw in 60 Minutes when a purchaser, a company that specializes in buying rentals, one of their executives made the mistake of telling Leslie Stahl that he didn't think millennials were interested in home ownership anymore, and got one real tough reaction from a whole lot of people around the country. Next slide, please. And I'll finish up because we're very close to the end here. There's a really interesting research out there from McKinsey with respect to how much time people want to spend at work. A lot of executives think that they're going to force, I think, people back to work full time. Yet Google, which is just opening up its new campus in the Lower West Side in New York, actually what they're basically saying is, we hope you'll come to work 3 days a week. So essentially the hybrid model looks like it's here to stay. This tells you sort of the preferences among employees, and generally speaking, a majority of employees are preferring no more than 3 days a week. And I think that's 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
I just want to add one quick point before you get to the panel on this issue, which is this is something that is already happening and has been happening in these communities, and these communities are very good for remote work. Irvine always had one of the largest percentages of people working at home, less commuting. And one of the things we point out in the piece and that we wrote, and I think is important, is not just that these suburbs, as Wendell said, are increasingly diverse. And if you go and visit those communities like we did in West Houston, they're amazingly diverse. But the other thing is that these communities may be much more environmentally friendly than many think. And when you get a chance to look at the report, Alan Berger at MIT did the analysis for us. And clearly we can build a better future. And that's what this is about. It's not about getting rid of one form or another. It's about providing a new opportunity for the next generation of Americans.
Good stuff. Before we turn to our panel, I'd like to throw a couple questions to you, Wendell and Joel. Clearly, based on what you presented, there's tremendous growth outside of core cities, both population and employment. People are obviously thinking about where's the best place to live, and they're attracted to the suburbs for their greater affordability, opportunity for more space, lower crime rates, et cetera. But nonetheless, a huge existing share of the population still live in cities. And proponents of city living, point to the greater cultural diversity of cities with all the growth that we saw in race and ethnicity of the suburbs. There's still arguably a lot more cultural diversity in cities, certainly the variety of restaurants, opportunities to eat in different cultures, the ability to move around without needing a car all the time, given higher walk scores, greater walkability, better access to public transportation, lower commute times. There also seems to be a lot to do there. Tourists, for example, when they come to a place, they're not typically going to the suburbs, they're going to the cities because that's where the museums and the art galleries and the variety of restaurants and, as well as many of our greatest educational institutions are in our urban core areas. So while the suburbs and the exurbs, offer more affordable real estate options and more space and certainly a high quality of life, how do they compete when it comes to the variety of entertainment, cultural, educational options to provide those other dimensions of life?
Well, I think that's very, it's very true, and it will never particularly change in terms of, I think that cities will always be the places where the history is, where the museums are, where accumulated wealth is, which creates all sorts of cultural institutions. What's different today is one, many of the suburbs have more culture. In terms of the food culture, as our suburbs become more ethnically diverse, the food gets better. The best Vietnamese food in America is right here in Orange County. This is definitely suburban. The best Indian food in the Houston area is in Fort Bend. So certain things, the suburbs are going to be more diverse, but the question, and they're going to be more interesting. In many ways, there's more sort of innovation in some areas in the suburbs and in the cities for lots of economic reasons. But the bottom line is, what Wendell and I have seen is educated people in their 20s into their early 30s are going to be attracted to core cities much more than other groups. But as people get into their 30s and 40s, instead of going to the jazz club 5 days a week, they go once a month. And that changes everything. So I think the suburbs are becoming more competitive. Also, many people are now getting much of their entertainment at home anyway. But I think cities will always have this appeal, but I think the suburbs are catching up.
I think you just dated yourself by saying they're going to jazz clubs. I think they're going to clubs. I'm not sure they're all jazz clubs.
Well, let me add, if I might, according to what we look at in terms of population density, transit use, et cetera, about 15% of the people are in the urban core. Now, that's not a small amount of number. The key is when people make their decisions about where they're going to live, they consider all these things. And this is what people are voting for. And listen, I love cities. But when I spent a bunch of time traveling in Europe 5-10 years ago, one thing I did, and when I've gone to China, I go to the suburbs. The reason I go to the suburbs is that's what nobody else has ever seen.
So you're one of those rare tourists that heads to the suburbs.
Yeah. Well, I see this. Yeah, but good. You can skip that slide.
Yeah, sorry, we missed one. Well, great. Well, thank you. I want to give our panelists an opportunity to respond. We have a great group of panelists here. Craig Collins, COO of Tavistock Development, is a part of a team of creative real estate developers creating a new American city, the Lake Nona community in Orlando, also sometimes referred to as Medical City. Jim Carmen is president of the Houston region for the Howard Hughes Corporation, the developers of the very successful the Woodlands, now Bridgeland and the Woodland Hills, three very important large-scale community developments that similarly fit the pattern that Wendell and Joel discuss in their report. And Joel Farkas, a veteran Colorado land developer with his firm Gateway American Resources, also actively involved in creating the community environments that are discussed in the report. So the question I want to throw out to all three of our panelists is, what's your reaction to the report? What do you take away in terms of the opportunities and challenges that it suggests for real estate development and creating the built environment? Joel Farkas, we'll start with you and then go to Craig and then to Jim.
Hi, thank you. So what I take away from the report is, there's not one answer to everything. But as a developer, having done this now 40 years, we have been met with this notion that the only place anyone ever will live will be in an urban setting. We have all kinds of famous economists who won Nobel Prizes who've said that. And that's just not true. So when we talk about cultural events in the urban area as competing with the suburban and exurban areas, there's a lot of different tastes, and we have 330 million Americans. So people are going to make different choices. So that is what we have seen as a challenge, and that kind of filters into the regulatory environment. But we're launching and starting construction of a community called Fruition in Colorado, which is 3,500 acres and 11,000 home sites, which is doing what our presenters have already described. And it's a combination. The way we have done that is not only develop the master plan community to provide all these different choices in an area that's affordable and safe, but our focus has also been to really take charge of all the infrastructure, water, sewer. In Colorado, a water tap is extraordinarily expensive, and in many other states in the Western United States, it could be $50,000 to $100,000 per home. So when we're talking about how do you provide an affordable, reasonably priced home, unless we attack infrastructure, and in the Western United States, infrastructure per home could be $100,000 to $250,000 per home. It's hard to do. So what we have done with Fruition is we are the developer, not only of the master plan community, but of the wastewater treatment facilities, the water treatment facilities, all storm drainage, all infrastructure, all transportation, all parks. And what we are able to do with that is we can attack one of the largest costs per home that gets very little attention, which is the tap fees and the municipal fees other jurisdictions charge. Secondarily, we believe strongly in home ownership. And we also believe in a diverse offering of home ownership, which is, and we have a big manufactured housing component of our community. We have more than 3,000 sites which are approved and entitled to allow manufactured housing, which is owned homes and owned lots, platted lots, just like any other home, not on leased land like people are familiar with over the last 40, 50 years. But somebody can come in, get a ranch style home, 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, 2-car garages, connected to a large planned community with other kinds of product types. And we will be able to do 2 things by offering 3 things by offering manufactured housing. As a
you got about 30 seconds left.
Okay. Number 1 is Fannie Mae has a loan program, which provides competitive financing, MH Advantage, to conventional home ownership. Number 2 is they're going to own the land, and number 3 is the location where people are living are part of the entire master plan, which typically hasn't been offered and entitled.
Thanks, Joel. Let's get to our other panelists. Craig.
Sure. After reading the paper, it affirmed, I think, what we have seen and what we have seen for some time. And, you know, the one question I always kept in the back of my mind when reading it was, we've all heard of the flight from the cities, but to what, right? And why? And so I think what the paper really did was galvanize our thoughts around it's affordable, it's amenitized, it's still in close proximity to the city. So that is something that we do focus on. I absolutely believe, and we have a keen focus on keeping the community diverse, not just you know, having a socioeconomic diversity within the community. One of the large things I think the paper spoke on, which I believe is come to as we've seen in Lake Nona, is the economic spread. Businesses are coming out of the cities. They're setting up shop out in the suburbs. The jobs aren't now getting on a commuter train and going an hour and a half into a city. The jobs are I'm getting up, going out of my house, getting on a bike and riding my bike to my office. We're seeing that to a great degree. We're seeing a work from home. We're seeing, you know, we own and operate a very extensive broadband network, and communal workspaces throughout the community. And then one thing to give my good friend Jim a little bit of time is the article really touched on it, and the authors weren't able to speak about it, but the introduction of autonomous vehicles. You know, so Lake Nona, we've introduced a fleet of autonomous vehicles, allowing people to move around. It's a micro mobility network. I think that's key. When we get out to the suburbs, it does not have to be car centric. There are ways that these communities in the suburbs can have the infrastructure necessary to move people around that is not focused only on a car. So well done to the authors, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. And last but not least, Jim Cartman.
Sure, thank you. You know, the study was great, and I appreciate all the mentions of the Woodlands and Bridgeland in there. But the data is showing exactly what we've seen, the migration of people from, you know, high cost, highly regulated areas into these communities that we're developing that provide accessible housing options, great amenities, outdoor amenities, and health and wellness and family really as the focus. And so it's validating what we're seeing as well. I think, you know, the challenge in our more suburban communities as we develop them is creating those urban-like amenities that are being craved by folks that are coming from those urban areas, or the millennials that are deciding to leave those urban areas. And that's, you know, your entertainment, your cultural events and activities and centers and art, great restaurants that were mentioned earlier. But that's a challenge as we develop in these more suburban areas, and it takes great patience to do so. And it's really a validation for us of our founders, Jim Rouse, George Mitchell, of our communities that really showed that commitment and long-term vision for master plan communities. I think Wendell, you know, you mentioned, Wendell, the population growth since 2010, primarily in suburban areas. You know, one thing we're really working hard is to get companies to the Woodlands particularly, but also to Bridgeland, is you didn't see the companies follow that migration into the suburbs. You saw those companies selecting their headquarters and major offices still in the urban cores. And I think that's a shift. That's a big change that's happened, is the talent is now going to these areas to live, and the companies, if they want people in the office, whether it's 3 days a week or 4 or 5, they're going to have to follow the talent. You know, it's no longer that, you know, one person in a corner office decides that the location is going to be in a central urban core and just expect everybody to drive in from the suburbs. These companies are going to have to continually look for opportunities to follow the talent where they're going, and that's to the suburbs. You know, a little bit was also mentioned about millennials. You know, for the first time in Bridgeland in 2020, when we reached #1 in Texas in home sales, our biggest home buyers were millennials. And you know, obviously, why did they do that? They're looking for great schools. They're starting to have children. They're looking for more room, accessible housing, and great outdoor amenities, health and wellness again. And so back to the challenge, in creating those urban amenities. Bridgeland now, we're edging towards 20,000 residents. Our full build out is 75,000. So we've got a long way to go. But we really haven't had a much of an urban or commercial focus yet. We're showing the same patients that George Mitchell did in the Woodlands prior to developing the Woodlands Town Center there. But I think in the next 1 or 2 years, you're going to see a significant expansion in Bridgeland on the commercial side to start to build those urban amenities that are going to be necessary to get that community up to that 75,000 mark and provide, really the quality of life that folks are striving for, where they want that outdoor accessibility, the more space, the affordable housing, but they definitely want to still go to great restaurants, still want to have their job center close. And those are the challenges as we continue to try to develop these communities in the suburbs and create self-sustaining ecosystems that don't rely on the urban centers.
Thank you, Jim. Good comments from all of our panelists. We've got a lot of really excellent questions here, so I want to turn to the audience Q&A here. I have a question here from Chris Lineberger, former RCLCO colleague of ours, asking Joel and Wendell, please discuss your findings about the urbanizing suburbs, downtown Bethesda, Pasadena, Reston Town Center, the Avalon up there in Alpharetta, near the Windward Master Plan community. It seems there's a trend of a lot of urbanization actually happening in suburban places, that people still want to create those kind of environments. I know when we're doing a lot of studies, one of the things we typically look at is walk scores seem to have a big impact on value. So Wendell, Joel, what about that urbanizing suburban trend?
Well, first, hi to Chris. Well, we know each other. Basically, I agree that there's going to be some sort of, it could be high rise. Very often it's sort of 4 or 5 story buildings. Like if you go to the Domain in Austin, this is I think what Chris is talking about. The Woodlands has a downtown. And what I'm seeing in many of these new developments is around the town center, you have a little bit denser housing, not necessarily high rise, but housing for either empty nesters or young people. In a funny way, the tragedy here is, as our great cities, which naturally have these amenities, have evolved, they've become either too expensive, too dangerous, certainly don't have the education to keep people. So as people, I don't think that the moment you move to the suburbia, your taste buds get taken out and your cultural aptitude falls to nothing. So I think what Chris is onto is something very important, which is, as we build out these new communities, this urban, if you will, aspect is part of it. Wendell and I are interested in how people live and how to make their lives better. We don't have any particular desire that everybody should live in, Leave It to Beaverland.
Good answer. Thank you. Jeffrey Moen. Hi, Jeff. I'll ask, the dates on these charts indicate pre-pandemic statistics. Do you think that the pandemic changed the data, stats, charts, et cetera? That's a Wendell question, I think. You're on mute, Wendell.
What? Wendell.
We're not getting.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, one of the charts certainly does not have any post-pandemic data to speak of. The one on the city sector model showing that the growth since 2010, and the reason for that, of course, is if you're using ACS 5-year data, its average is 2 to 3 years old. However, on the first chart, we were looking at the net domestic migration. That was the pandemic is that huge drop that occurs from 2020 to 2021. It was absolutely shocking, and it is still early, and we don't know what's going to happen. And it may be next year that it all turns around, but you had a huge drop in net domestic migration between 2020 and 2021. So that's all during the pandemic period, July to July. And then you think about that, beyond that, the city of New York, I think its population loss was about 350, 400,000 people, population loss. San Francisco lost 10 years worth of growth in 1 year, went from 800, well, it went down 55,000 people to its 2011 population. So now that wasn't on the charts, but that's the kind of thing that has been happening and showing up with respect to the new data out there.
So a question from Paula Munger. Not everybody can work from home. For example, service workers. Master plan communities are typically can be expensive place to live. More single family than multifamily houses, and a lot of service workers obviously are not able to work remotely. So what opportunities are there in these new American cities? Maybe that's Jim Carmen. I see you nodding. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, sure. It was important of our founders to have a wide variety of housing types. I think it's important for local jurisdictions to understand true master plan communities and allowing for smaller lot widths. 30-foot, 35-foot lot widths are bringing affordability side to home owning as well. And we've seen in a lot of more suburban counties that there's some diversion away from that. So that's important. Multifamily, as these communities start to urbanize, will obviously be an option as well. But we also developing the Woodlands Hills. We recognize that the Woodlands, now almost 50 years into its development cycle, nearing build out, needs almost a suburban component to the Woodlands. And so that was our thought process in starting to develop the Woodlands Hills. It's 15 miles away. It provides that accessibility to housing at a lower level than the Woodlands does. But yeah, it's certainly a focus, but it's something that we have our eye on, because we do need folks to work in these communities at all levels.
Yeah, let me add,
If I could.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, let me add very quickly. There is one great gain for service workers, and I understand absolutely, we're never going to be able to do the plumbing by somehow telecommuting. But the basic point is what we're seeing is huge reductions in traffic, not only overall reductions in traffic, but when the traffic is occurring, peak period traffic loads are dropping. Now, maybe in places where, with all due respect, they may look like they're overblown with freeways, but they actually have less freeway mileage per capita than most other places in the country, like LA and San Francisco. Maybe it doesn't look that good anymore, but the last chart I wasn't able to show you shows a huge decline in traffic congestion around the country. And if we could get to the point where 20 to 40% of our people are working at home, that is going to make the commute for service workers better. Now, that's not the same as if they're being able to work from home, but it is a benefit.
I hear someone else wanted to weigh in on that.
I think Craig did.
Oh, I was just going to say, for Jim's comment, I think that's right. I think we continue to focus on the diversity of price point. I think it's product variation. I think it's for sale housing. I think it's multifamily. I think it's single family rental. And we have an affordability issue that we're dealing with, the affordability issues in the city, the affordability issues in the suburbs, right? And the other thing too about service workers, I think those service workers are also in these suburban new cities. I mean, as hotels and restaurants and all of these things come, I think this vision of the service worker, getting that service worker, affordable housing in the community, one way or another, we developers do it. I think that employment is actually much closer than we have traditionally thought it was.
And this is Joel, one brief comment. In our community, we're delivering for sale, for owned manufactured housing. Service workers are going to be able to own a home in our community.
We are out of time. So a big thank you to all of our presenters and panelists who participated in joining us today, and to our audience that threw out a lot of great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. This seems to be a topic with a lot of interest. Maybe this is a theme we should continue in future webinars. I'll leave you with a reminder that this webinar was recorded and will be available on our website, along with all of the slides and links to the report. And you can always reach out directly to any of us with questions as well. So thank you, and be sure to tune in again next month.
Thank you.